people who may have been displaced from war zones, and that company is making money not only out of the technology that is used in those war zones, but is then also used in the policing of people that have fled. And we can see that across the board.
For years, politicians around the world have insisted that the answer to undocumented immigration is a stronger, more fortified border. The reasoning has a simple, seductive logic to it. But it's wrong. It's just wrong. There's no other way to say it. It's wrong. Decades of research has shown that people determined to move find a way to move. And when states respond with border controls, people turn to smugglers to circumvent these borders. And on the cycle goes, with increasingly militarized borders on the one hand, and increasingly desperate people on the other, taking riskier and riskier journeys. What we need is an actual adult conversation that acknowledges the realities of migration, the fact that war, famine, persecution, and climate change continue to render millions homeless and in need of safety, that the long shadow of colonialism cannot simply be wished away, and finally, human migration is not a crisis. It's just a phenomenon that has stayed with us for as long as we've been human. But politicians don't want to have this conversation or engage with this research. But it's easier just to lean into people's prejudices and spend billions buying shiny technology from private corporations to prop up the myth of strong borders. And when that doesn't work, well, you just spend some more money to buy some more tech in the hope that this time things will be different. To understand this dynamic at work, today we're talking to Lucy Mablin and Joe Turner. Lucy is a senior lecturer at the University of Sheffield, and Joe is a lecturer at the University of York. Lucy and Joe are part of Channel Crossings, a team of academics whose research shows the UK government has spent over £3.5 billion in public money over the last 7 years to support a sprawling, almost entirely privatized apparatus of drone operations, databases and detention centers, radar maintenance, industrial cleaners, night vision camera providers, ID specialists, electricity providers, personnel trainers, location tracking software, parking fees. The list goes on, all to stop desperately vulnerable people from using small boats to cross the English Channel and apply for asylum here in the United Kingdom. £3.5 billion. It's easy to look at this number and say, this is why we need strong borders. So let me say this again, because it's a hard concept to wrap your head around. The militarized border is part of the problem. More militarized borders are unlikely to be the solution. In fact, Lucy and Joe's work suggests that the current situation around immigration in the UK is a largely self-manufactured crisis, which was eye-opening to me. So I think that's where we're going to start today. As always, this is In Solidarity, and I'm your host, Aman Sethi. Hi, Lucy. Welcome to the show. Let's start by taking the long view. When you say the current situation is a largely manufactured crisis, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, so I think the first thing to understand is the relationship between what we'll call irregular migration. So when people move across borders without authorization, some people would call illegal migration. The relationship between irregular migration, borders, and smuggling. So when you put a border somewhere, people, especially people who are forced migrants, who are refugees, perhaps they would like to seek asylum, they don't stop moving. So as soon as you put that border there, put that extra barrier to them moving, they will continue to move. But the only way that they'll be able to move, often the more intense the bordering is to employ the services of smugglers. So as soon as you have bordering somewhere, you then produce smuggling. It's like a phenomenon all over the world across history that we know very well about. People continue to move and they often employ smugglers to help them move. But then states respond to that by saying, oh, hold on, what we need is more bordering. And so over time, a dynamic occurs where you have some some kind of border fortifications, some rules, some ways to prevent people from moving. You have people continuing to move irregularly, in part through employing smugglers, and then you get more border fortification. And we see this phenomenon in loads of border zones around the world. There's a massive body of research about it. And in the Channel border zone, what that's meant is that over time, the routes that people have taken to cross the Channel have been augmented by the border controls. So when the Channel Tunnel opened, people were trying to walk through the Channel Tunnel. Lots of money was spent to prevent that being a possibility. For a couple of decades, people stowed away in lorries and other kinds of vehicles. And over time, the kind of level of fortification to prevent that, like secure lorry parks, giant X-ray machines for lorries, sniffer dogs, lots of technology, meant that those routes became difficult and unviable. In 2018, people started to move in small boats, and then with the massive slowing down, halting of freight travel in the pandemic, the route kind of completely shifted towards small boats. So you've got this relationship playing out all the time, where you have irregular migration, borders, and smuggling locked into this relationship together, and you can't understand one part of that without understanding the others.
What I find interesting about your work is that you describe the border as almost a set of changing rules, in the sense that one could look at a border and say, well, this is a border and no one is allowed to cross, except that there seem to be over a sort of, let's say, even after World War II, many different ways in which certain kinds of people are allowed at certain kinds of time, and then certain kinds of people are not allowed at other sorts of time. Could you kind of talk to us about that a little bit, about how we should understand borders? Because we, as lay people, tend to just see them as sort of these inviolable rules. But what your work seems to suggest is this is far more of a kind of dynamic negotiation that's rooted as much in race and geopolitics as geography, as people tend to think about this.
I guess what your question was also alluding to is maybe some of the history around this and the way in which the border has become kind of naturalized and seen as something that's sort of common sense. And here we need to think about the history of the 20th century and also the history of European colonialism as well to get at some of this. And Lucy has written about this in a lot more detail than me in regards to questions of asylum. But I guess one of the first things that's worth recognizing is that borders aren't just a product of the nation state as such. They were created as practices to control the mobility of people throughout European empires. So the idea of controlling people's international mobility isn't something that just comes up through the process of, say, decolonization, but it's actually central to the logics of governing European empires. And we can see that in a multitude of ways. For example, the regulation of indentured labourers throughout the 19th century. So this is when millions of people were essentially put into indentured contracts and sent around the world to work on plantations in places as far wide as South Africa, Fiji, British Guyana. And essentially, in that forced mobility of people to work, and from places like India and China in particular, the British government and other agencies had to start regulating the movement of those people. And so we have things such as deportation rules that come out of that. We have things such as identity documents in order to pass into a country, in order to be able to work. And so this whole infrastructure builds up around what we now know as borders to control international mobility. And of course, that affects some people and doesn't affect others. So these kind of rules were not affected in terms of colonial administrators, but they were if you were, for example, a labourer from India, and you could be deported essentially at the whim of the local authorities, but also employers as well.
Yeah, and I suppose sort of fundamentally in what Joe is saying is that borders are about not only they're about preventing some people from moving and facilitating the movement of others. It's also about making sure that the movement of other groups of people is at no point, or goods as well, is at no point interrupted 365 days of the year. So it's like a filter. And what is the logic of that filter? It is highly racialized, of course, and it follows these logics that Joe was talking about that emerge from colonialism. So in relation to asylum in the UK, in the post-Second World War period, we have a period in which people who are refugees are thought of in Britain and Europe more widely to be often Cold War refugees who are politically convenient, who are white, and who are welcomed. In the late 1990s, the early 2000s, we start to see more people arriving in countries, including the UK, who are black and brown and came from often former colonies. And that's because of new conflicts that are breaking out, but also because of the affordances of new kinds of international travel. The response to this, if we just stick to Britain for now, and the response to this in Britain was not that these were people who were refugees and that there are now more refugees seeking asylum in the UK. The response was that these are people from poor countries, they are racialized, and they must therefore be economic migrants trying to cheat their way into Britain. And that was the entire framing from the beginning.
You talk about this when you talk about the myths of the so-called pull factors, right? Where you say that there's an understanding that we all have that which feeds into this idea of these are economic migrants, they're not real refugees, that everyone is moving for a better life, they're moving for our jobs, they're moving for all the privileges that come with a lifestyle in the West. But your work seems to suggest that pull factors are in some ways a myth. Could you tell us why that is? Because it seems counterintuitive.
Yeah. So I guess the first thing to say is obviously people are seeking a better life, because if you're a refugee, you are seeking a better situation. And that if you did want to work in the place, the Ukrainians want to come here and they want to work and start a normal life as anybody would want to. And that's the case for anyone who is a refugee. But at the same time, there's been a huge amount of research on how people who end up seeking asylum in a particular country, like what kinds of things make a difference to that. So it's difficult to talk about choices because choices in the context of forced migration are highly constrained and lots of different factors shape where you end up going. But if we talk about choice, all of the research, or rather the research has failed across decades of investigation, both quantitative studies of destination, like asylum applications and countries of origin, but also qualitative research, which is like interviewing people about their choices. All different types of research have just failed to find any proof that particular things such as the right to work or the level of welfare support is like a pull factor, that someone is in Eritrea in the middle of a difficult conflict situation, and that the thing that is pulling them to the UK specifically is particular level of universal credit, or that they know they can enter the labour market. People tend not to have a good sense of particular public policies and social policies in particular countries, and then the ability to also navigate in different languages, different websites of different governments to do a kind of compare and contrast job. So it seems to make intuitive sense to us until we start to look into the details of what your circumstance would be if you were, like, say, in Syria, in Afghanistan now, and wanting to escape. And actually, the reality is that you'd be more likely to want to go to the UK because your brother is in London, and that's the thing that's pulling you, than because you know about the particular policies, and that's pulling you, and you've compared and contrasted them to Germany and found the UK to be more favourable.
Hi, my name is Sian Norris, and I'm a senior investigative reporter at openDemocracy. My work investigating military sexual abuse, telling the stories of those at the sharp end of government anti-migrant policies, exploring prison data, and reporting on the dark money powering anti-abortion interests is only made possible thanks to your support. please donate to support Open Democracy today. Simply visit opendemocracy.net/donate. Thank you.
Right. So we've got this idea of the fact that the border, which is seen as an act of geography, is also an act of politics. We've got the fact that in a kind of post-war, post-colonial period, the people who are on the move are changing, and they're changing from kind of, World War II and Cold War refugees to people from the majority world. And let's kind of jump ahead to like the 2020s, as it were, or the late 2010s, where we start seeing the assemblage of what you describe in your work as a sort of massive borders industrial complex. And again, for our listeners, why don't we start with telling them what a borders industrial complex is, and also how you guys got interested in this research?
So kind of broadly, the idea that the state doesn't have the capacity or isn't best suited to provide particular services, right? So that's a kind of longer historical process that has been identified and discussed, obviously, in more detail elsewhere. But what we see in terms of the border in this period is that there's this kind of provision of services by private companies, and that goes alongside the expansion of detention estates in the UK, which happens from the early 2000s, which are often privatised and famously go into the hands of G4S, Serco, these big private security companies that have been talked about a lot in the media over the last couple of decades. But we also, in a more kind of everyday sense, see the services being provided by private actors in all sorts of different spaces. And I guess that's what we're trying to talk about by the border industrial complex, which is that there are these sets of relationships that, through the state's outsourcing of particular services, creates these lines of dependency between private actors, often major big multinational corporations, the function of the state, which is part of its function under the logic of liberal post-colonial capitalism is to kind of police a border in a particular way, and the movement of people, that actual everyday regulation of people. So it's these set of relationships that we're trying to get at. And one of the things we became increasingly interested in was that the infrastructure that we were seeing in Calais as part of the project, so the security infrastructure that Lucy mentioned, the aerial surveillance, the lorry park security guards, the detention facilities, the fencing, for example, has all been contracted out to private organisations, right? And we can see the exact same thing happening in the UK as well, and at different levels throughout the regulation of mobility. So whether that be where people are picked up in Dover, or whether it be the surveillance and data algorithms that are used to kind of regulate suspicious and risky people at particular ports. So we sort of see this all coming together.
One of the things that becomes hard for people, including myself, to understand is just how much kind of tech and systems are out there. So is there a way that if you could try and say, let's imagine that an individual tries to get is in France and tries to get onto a boat and tries to come to the UK, what are the sorts of things that have been the obstacles and the tech that's been put in place to try and stop this process?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's all sorts of tech, which means that people aren't going to try and stow away in a lorry at all now. So there's CO2 detectors, there's human sniffer dogs that can detect humans, X-ray machines. There's many man-made lakes in Calais. There's been massive deforestation, so people can't camp in concealed forest areas. There's all sorts of things that have been done in that area to surveil people, and the French, the riot police have a kind of a permanent presence there, surveilling for people who may be around. If you drive to the port of Dover, you'll find miles of fences and flyovers and things. So that's not really an option, trying to stow away, even though people that have no money, because it's very expensive to get on a small boat, people who had no money are still, especially like young Sudanese men at the moment, people that are not well resourced are still attempting to break through those. When people are crossing the channel in small boats, this is then a highly surveilled thing. This is the busiest shipping lane in the world. Small boats must not be allowed to disrupt that shipping trade, and the every day, every night ferries, freight travel through that shipping lane. So there are drones. There's a sentry watchtower in Dover. There's, oh God, what else is there, Joe?
Radar, reconnaissance flights as well, often through the MOD, regular reconnaissance flights that do that kind of surveillance as well with radar systems as well.
So people are tracked at every stage of this journey as soon as they've left the shore in France, and they're collected by Border Force and taken ashore. And then at that point, they will, of course, go through the whole UK system of being fingerprinted. They'll be temporarily detained. All of their biometrics will be taken, and they will be dispersed to a different location around the country. And they're now kind of under the surveillance of the asylum system, or in a kind of fast-track deportation process. I think it's worth just going back a step and saying something about how we came to do this work about looking at these private companies. So we didn't actually set out, we didn't originally plan to do this. But as we were going through our project, looking at UK government responses to small boat channel crossings, we were just so baffled by the fact that none of these policies would work. They were just feeding more irregular migration, and we knew the journeys, the routes were going to getting more dangerous. They were going to get more dangerous. More people are dying. More people would continue to keep dying. Like, why do this plan, that do any of these strategies that don't work? And then we started talking about who benefits from this, whose interests does this crisis serve, and then we just started looking into some of the contracts, and this led us down this path where we've ended up building this big database of private contracts to try and understand the scale and scope of different companies that are involved in different technologies. And it really was beyond what we expected, and we've learned a lot through that process, I think.
Talk me through some of the highlights of what you found in this database. Like, what is the kinds of contracts? What is the size of these contracts?
So I think one of the things that's worth kind of highlighting from the very beginning is that it's the kind of diversity of contracts that we can see, and the kind of the different services that are provided, which are obviously at different financial scales. But we found, some of the largest contracts are for things like aerial surveillance. So that'll be things like the provision of drones, but also the servicing and running of drones as well. And the largest contract we've got in the database is for a contract with Tekeva, which is a Portuguese military defense contractor who have provided drones for the war in Ukraine, as well as other things. And so that's a £1 billion contract for that.
Wow.
Aerial surveillance. So that was over a 3-year period. And as you can imagine, and we haven't really touched upon this as yet, this information isn't easily available to the public. So the agreement between Tekeva and the Home Office is heavily redacted. They've been very resistant at freedom of information requests regarding this particular contract from the very beginning.
Yeah, so I just think one of the really interesting things for me is how there are some things that we perhaps expected to find. So you find some very large multinationals, defense multinationals here, who perhaps are involved in some war zones producing forced migrants, and then involved in bordering those people, stopping those people from moving here. And that's politically interesting, I guess. But I think some of the most fascinating ones for me are in the broader economy that is produced here, that we might not call the border industrial complex. I don't know, we're still negotiating about ways to talk about this, but this broader economy, which isn't necessarily made up of businesses that see themselves as doing slightly controversial bordering or defence work, but businesses who do services like marquees, like catering, like coach travel. So the King's Ferry Company got a £2.7 million contract, for example, for coach services for Border Force. There were like a British event catering got £700,000 for emergency catering for Border Force operations.
One of the things I found interesting about your work, or maybe horrifying about your work, is that some of the companies that are involved are, in a sense, defense contractors. So you have companies that make money on in the business of war, and now the same companies make money in the business of containing refugees. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, no, we can see that across the board. So I mean, probably one of the most significant, and I think widely publicised even prior to the work that we've been doing, is say the use of contracts for drones with Elbit Systems. So the Israeli defence company, which, as we mentioned in our analysis in the openDemocracy text that was published this week, that defence company advertises its technology as being battle tested in inverted commas, which essentially means battle tested on people in occupied Palestine, right? And as part of the ongoing genocide. And so that we can see the kind of loop there in terms of these are battle tested drones, aerial surveillance equipment, which is battle tested in Palestine and is then used to police irregular mobility across the English Channel, right? People who may have been, as you say, displaced from war zones, and that company is making money not only out of the technology that is used in those war zones, but is then also used in the policing of people that have fled. And we can see that across the board. We can think about that in the relationship to BAE Systems as well, right? And its role in say, for example, providing arms and technology in Saudi's war in Yemen, for example. And let alone the kind of more historical dimensions of the British state's role in the Middle East and in interventions in Africa as well. So there is this kind of constant interplay that we're really interested in, and I think that once we start thinking about that, this opens up another interesting avenue which we've yet to explore in detail, but is also the financialization of all of this as well, right? So the size of the border industry is growing globally, we know this. So MITI, which is not a defense company, but basically works in subcontracting. Barclays and HSBC have up to 27 million of shares in MITI. There's 22 million shares that are held by BlackRock. In BAE Systems, Goldman Sachs has 165 million. So we can see the kind of the circulations of these big asset management firms, the money they have invested in these border technology companies. And also, we can think about the pools of money that are also going to kind of fossil fuel companies as well, which obviously plays a wider part in the climate crisis. So there is lots of circulations that are needed to be figured out and worked along.
I'm going to ask like a really unfair question, but I think an important question, which is that when confronted with work like this, and then when we talk about financialization, obviously my head is going to, well, then if you have a pension, turns out you're probably invested in one of these companies as well in some way. And very often I find myself, when examining the nature of capitalism, where you're just like, oh my God, it's all capitalism. And then you want to just sit down under your desk. But obviously you want people to do more than that. How does one hold all of this, or how do you actually hold all of this in your head? And what can some of us do about this? Is there anything that we can do to help? Is there anything? I know you have a spreadsheet that we should explore and send you tips, but how do people listening to this podcast engage with this idea?
Yeah, well, I think for us, it has been very eye-opening also to look into this. And one of the things that's been most striking is how there is so much analysis and and critique and discussion about some areas of public spending, like how much money is spent on disabled people not being able to work, for example. So much scrutiny of every detail, of every penny that should be taken away from them, because, over the past few weeks. But in this area, we find there's so little transparency, so little scrutiny, so little public accountability to engage with some of the fundamental questions connected to this for us as citizens, as taxpayers. So, so why is so much of it outsourced to these private companies? Why are these methods used which we know are counter to available evidence, and we know that the Home Office know that they're counter to the available evidence? So it's a genius business model because it doesn't work, but every single year forever into the future, you can promise there's a new technology that will be better, that will be able to solve some dimension. There's always something you can sell. So, but why is there absolutely no conversation about the fact that it will all evidence indicates it will perpetually fail, and that different, more sustainable approaches might be needed? So I think, to answer your question, just literally asking questions about this, actually conveying an interest about this as an area that deserves some political scrutiny and discussion, even as our attention is constantly being drawn to how much money is spent on the most marginalised people in society.
In Solidarity is produced by James Battersill, Ayodeji Rutinwa, and Carla Abreu. The theme song is Odyssey by Edward Abella. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review on your podcast platform of choice. And if you thought today's episode was really awesome and you'd like to help support us in making more, head to opendemocracy.net/donate. Again, thank you so much for listening and have a great day.